Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. On today's episode of me talking about 7 things, I'm going to be going over episode 7 of Apocalypse. Now, before I continue, please check out the links in the description below. Now, Stephen Lee Hall Jr., Alexa, and Frank are at the water source with the hippos and continue their hike, and they make it to another water hole with a boat and a cage. Then we get the introduction to the episode, some flashback narration, all that jazz, and we are still on day 22, like at the end of last episode. Teal goes exploring in the abandoned building near Joe's camp and finds some washers, which do come back later. Waz and Joe go looking for honey, and Joe is still on the fence about leaving. Waz spots a potential beehive, and he and Joe work on getting it. Waz doesn't think honey is in the tree, and Joe gives it a go, but he feels a little dizzy while on the table. He recovers, but Waz is worried about him. Joe tries to make a tea from the sap, but it drops since the cup burned his hands a little bit. And Waz talks about how Joe may not complete the challenge if he stays behind. Later, Joe wants to go scorpion hunting and asks if anyone wants to go with him, and Waz says he will, while Teal says no. As Joe leaves the shelter, he passes out and hits his head a little bit, and Teal calls for a medic, and he has a light wound above his eyebrow, and Teal is very worried about him, and the medic says he has heat exhaustion. His vitals are stable, and he will be monitored to see if he has a concussion. Joe decides he wants to leave with Teal and Waz because it's better to be with partners so everyone can look out for each other. That night, Teal talks about leaving, and Joe is happy to have partners. Stephen Lee Hall Jr., Alexa, and Frank are confused about the cage and the boat. The area was used as a game reserve and had hunting outposts and equipment. The cage was used for game animals to protect them from predators before being reintroduced to the wild. Stephen convinces the other two to sleep in the cage. The three get to work on getting water and setting up camp. Stephen gets a fire going while Alexa gets firewood. Then Frank and Alexa decide to go fishing while Stephen gets the firewood. The three settle into the cage shelter for the night, and they hear fish, and against probably some better judgment and maybe some rules from producers, Frank decides to leave the cage to try to get some fish, and Alexa goes to film him on the GoPro, and he does manage to dispatch a fish with one of his arrows, so the three are able to eat for the night, and then later the three hear hyenas out in the darkness near their camp. Wes and Stephen Kelly continue to fish. Wes sets up some passive lines. They still have to deal with a crocodile and realize there is a second crocodile at their water source. Wes has a discussion with Stephen, and they decide it is time to migrate. They want to try to get as much food as they can before moving on and make some figure 4 traps. Day 23, Waz and Teal pack up their things and set a course for their next destination. Joe wants to take the wheelchair on the journey, and the three decide to set out. They comment on the heat and how tiring the hike is, and there is some worry over the fact that Joe has a wheelchair and they have to clear the path, and he has to pick it up over large down trees and whatnot, and it's taking a lot of time. And unfortunately, one of the wheels falls off, but luckily Teal has some washers that helps Joe put the wheel back on, and they are trekking, and Teal talks about how exhausting the hike is, and they do find a water source, and it turns out they find the camp of Stephen Lee Hall Jr., Alexa, and Frank, but it was the one they made before migration, so unfortunately there is no merge yet, and they wonder why Stephen, Frank, and Alexa left, because they had no idea, because they don't see what we see, but luckily everyone's okay, and everything's fine. The three decide to stay for the night. Alexa, Stephen Lee Hall Jr., and Frank work on their shelter. They gather branches to surround the cage to keep the animals away, and they also gather some branches to put on top of the cage for some extra shade, and Alexa and Steve work on that. And that night, the three hear some noises in the darkness. Wes and Steven check on their traps, but they're all empty, and Wes gets some mopani to eat, and Steve checks the passive lines, but unfortunately the bait is gone. Day 24, Waz, Teal, and Joe get ready to move on. They check the map and make a plan on getting to their next destination 7 miles away. Teal is very tired, and Joe adds a few more things to his wheelchair. I believe it's called the Wheel-da-Beast. That's what Waz called it, and Waz was being a little sassy and saying, why don't you put one of the cars on top of the wheelchair as well? And Joe was saying how he'll put the wheelchair in one of the trunks and they could drive out of there. So, there's some funny banter, even though it was probably irritating to Teal and Waz a little bit that Joe had the wheelchair, but they're making it work and no one's snipping at each other. And luckily there's some cloud cover when Teal, Waz, and Joe set out, so that's good that they're not hiking while the sun is right above them and burning them. And after hiking for several miles, they spot the water source and the cage, and they find and merge with Stephen Lee Hall Jr., Frank, and Alexa's group. Waz and Steven are happy to see each other since they've been on challenges together in the past. Alexa and Teal are happy there is another woman in the challenge, and Frank and Joe chat, and Frank is happy for the extra materials that Joe brought. Waz and Teal are a little worried about the cage situation. The sleeping in the cage situation is discussed, and we hear them talking about the growing group dynamics. That night, Waz comments about the sleeping situation and the animal activity, and the group is later awoken that night by what seems to be an elephant. Wes and Steven go to check their traps and plan to migrate the next day, and they do some fishing, and Wes successfully gets a terrapin to eat, and the two feast during the night on the terrapin that Wes caught. So good for him for being able to get that much needed food for them before they move out. Day 25. Alexa, Waz, Frank, Joe, Teal, and Steven wake up and talk about the sleeping situation, nightly animal activity, and they talk about making necessary adjustments. The plan is to make an exterior boma using massive branches to make a wall, and those sleeping outside can crawl on top of the cage if need be. Joe goes hunting, and he goes to the water source where there are a few hippos, and for some reason he gets really close to the water's edge, and that has me a little on edge because there are hippos nearby. But he gets away from the water's edge and finds an area to set up a blind, and he spots some guinea fowl, but unfortunately misses, and he decides to go back to camp before it gets too hot. Waz, Frank, and Steven complete the work on the outside boma. Teal checks out the boat to see if there's a spot where catfish can hang out under it and tries noodling. And then Joe relays the info about the guinea fowl near the hippo water source when he comes back. And Joe really wants to be successful at hunting and provide for his team. And Teal decides to stand on the boat and watch the fish activity from above. Unfortunately, the water is murky, but she is able to see some movement under the surface and some bubbles, and she takes a few shots and is successfully able to dispatch a catfish. So congrats to Teal for getting a catfish, congrats to Frank for getting a catfish earlier, and the group is able to eat. And Wes and Steven get ready to migrate. They plan to hike 5.5 miles to where the big group is already located. Once they get there, everyone will have about 8 miles to trek so they can get to civilization, since there's not really an extraction, it's more of an escape kind of thing. And they set off and they hike a few miles and are struggling in the heat. And they also enter some leopard territory, so they have to keep their heads on a swivel. And they find a building and go exploring. And it is a supply station and processing outpost. They gather some stuff from the house, and Steven also spots a bat to try to use as bait, but it gets away. And they aren't really able to stay there for very long because there's no water nearby, so they decide to move on. After a while, they find the big group and they all merge. That's right, we have the final 8 survivalists. Stephen Lee Hall Jr., Waz, Wes, Frank, Alexa, Joe, Stephen, Kelly, and Teal all merging with one another. Yay! And the group rearranges the cage area so everyone can fit inside the cage and boma. And everyone is worried about the fact that there are 8 mouths to feed. And we hear a few talking heads about how difficult the environment is and how they need to escape. And they need to figure out the sleeping situation. They need to try to get food. And there's a lot going on. And they say they have about a week left in the challenge, even though the Chiron earlier in the episode said it's day 25. But who knows? And the episode ends. And we have 1 episode remains, and kudos to everyone for making it this far in the challenge. I really hope all 8 will make it through. I think all 8 make it through. We shall see. Hopefully, they can all make it through and successfully get through this very tough 35-day challenge. And episode 8, Armageddon Out. Days from the end, Teal's sudden tailspin threatens her challenge. Desperate for food, the remaining survivalists use scavenged wire to dredge the pond. With no rescue coming, they must escape the apocalyptic landscape to return to civilization. Dun dun dun. And as of day 25, Stephen Lee Hall Jr. has 297 days, only 3 days from 300. Good for him. Waz has 165 days. Wes has 121. Frank has 60. And Alexa, Joe, Stephen, Kelly, and Teal have 46. And Joe seems to have 33 days alone total. He says that he has been alone 17 days on this challenge, even though I didn't count the days that his partner left as days that he spent alone. I thought it was 15, but no, it's 17. And then he had 16 days alone on his previous challenge. So 17 plus 16 is 33. So 7 days short of winning the record of most days survived alone, but he is able to have some partnership, and I'm very happy for him because he spent so much time alone, and he seems to be getting along well with the group, and I really hope he's able to have some success at hunting. And thank you all so much for listening. Please like, comment nice things, and subscribe, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.